When I arrived at First English 15 years ago, it didn't take long for me to hear about the welcome place. And to understand this congregation has long desired to be a place of welcome and belonging. The title of today's sermon is A Spirit of Belonging, Sharing the Mind and Love of Christ. And sharing the mind of Christ doesn't mean an intellectual response. It's a matter of the heart. It's not about lifting up self. It's about lifting up others and caring for others. In the gospel today, people were tripping up all over themselves, over their own egos. They had no answer, the chief priests and elders, when Jesus asked if the baptism from John was from heaven or if it was from this world. And they didn't really seem concerned about whether or not they were in God's presence or experiencing God's work, and more about protecting themselves and their control, more about protecting their image than they were about God's mission and ministry, right? The parable that Jesus tells follows that same trajectory by talking about the importance of actions versus words. You can say all the words you want, but unless you follow it up with actions, are you really following God's will? And we also can get all caught up in words and in our own egos, in our own control, and forget about the mission and ministry we share. But as I look at that theme, cultivate a spirit of belonging, I'm drawn to the reading from Philippians, which contains one of the earliest known hymns of the Christian church. I'm going to be reading from the Message, Eugene Peterson's translation, and I hope that you'll consider closing your eyes and hearing these words anew. If you've gotten anything out of following Christ, if his love has made any difference in your life, if being in a community of the Spirit means anything to you, if you have a heart, if you care, then do me a favor. Agree with each other, love each other, be deep-spirited friends. Unity, this kind of working together, understands that we need each other's voices, we need each other's involvements, we need each other's arguments. We all have blind spots. And in order to operate through the mind of Christ, we need each other. As we work together, we need to listen for the voices of those without power. We need to augment those quieter voices. Otherwise, unity can actually just become conformity to the strongest and most strident voices. And that's how this passage has often been used through the years, to promote a sort of hierarchical thinking. Saint Simeon, around the year 1000, was praising this kind of obedience, blind obedience, and said, talked about the monk who planted their feet immovably on the rock of obedience to their spiritual father, who listens to his teachings as if they came from the mouth of God. There's a sort of beauty in self-denial and not doing what we want to do. But this is a sort of obedience that can keep in place unhealthy power dynamics. We need the sort of unity that is built on respect, on humility and love, on listening to each other. We go on reading in Philippians. Don't push your way to the front. Don't sweet talk your way to the top. Put yourself aside and help others get ahead. Don't be obsessed with getting your own advantage. Forget yourself long enough to lend a helping hand. Sharing the mind of Christ means acting in humility and loving our neighbors. It means letting go of that what's in it for me attitude. That's the kind of humility shown by Christ. And now we get to the Christ hymn. These beautiful words were likely written within 20 years of Jesus' death and already established as a hymn of the church by the time of Paul. Think of yourself the way Christ Jesus thought of himself. He had equal status with God, but didn't think so much of himself that he had to cling to the advantages of that status no matter what. Not at all. When the time came, he set aside the privileges of deity and took on the status of a slave, became human. Having become human, he stayed human. It was an incredibly humbling process. He didn't claim special privileges. Instead, he lived a selfless, obedient life and then died a selfless, obedient death, and the worst kind of death at that, crucifixion. The humility that Jesus showed in this passage was countercultural to the honors-seeking society that he lived in, the Roman society of the day, not about an upward mobility, but rather a downward mobility, a letting go, a relinquishing of advantage and honoring others, an emptying of self in love. What is our response to this self-emptying? It's here we come to one of the most difficult parts to interpret. Therefore, my beloved, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. With fear and trembling. What does fear and trembling have to do with our salvation? Is it as if we don't do enough works, God is going to smite us? And some theologians have talked in those terms, that if we don't do enough good, that we won't make heaven, that that's what salvation is about. But it is important for us as a people to know where this term comes from, fear and trembling. When Moses led the people of Israel out of bondage in Egypt, they came to Mount Sinai, where God handed out the 10 Commandments to Moses. And he went up on Mount Sinai. And as he was up there, there was thunder and lightning, and God's presence was so palpable that people could see it, and they were afraid. This is the fear and trembling that is talked about, knowing. They knew that they were in God's presence. In fact, they said to Moses, "Do not let God speak to us, lest we die." They knew they were in the presence of the creator of the universe, the one who held their lives in his hands. We too are called to live in God's presence with fear and trembling, to know that the ultimate power in the universe is with us, beside us, every day. And just as Moses' face shone when he came down from that mountain, we are to shine with God's love, to be a witness to God's presence in the world. And one of the things that's so exciting for me is that this passage isn't just in singular, it's in plural. You all shine, like the Southern y'all. You all shine. You all work out your salvation with fear and trembling. You all figure out how you are going to do ministry. You have seen in these videos various places where we are already or hope to do ministry. And it's part of our job as we work out of that salvation to figure out how we might best shine God's love and presence and sense of belonging, how we might share the mind of Christ to the people around us. We all are to recognize that we shine with the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ. As we cultivate a spirit of belonging, how are we going to share the mind and the humility of Christ as individuals and as a church? As a church, how are we being called into self-emptying service? How are we, as a people together, going to shine with the presence of God?